Welcome everybody to today's Research Forum on Early Childhood Education, Innovation, Engagement and Leadership, to be presented by Dr. Marianne Theobald, Professor Susan Danby, Professor Susan Irvine of QUT, and Professor Amy Cutter-Mackenzie-Knowles of Southern Cross University. My name is Angela Ferguson, for those who don't know me. I'm the Director of Research Services in the Department's Strategic Policy and Intergovernmental Relations branch. So welcome, thank you for coming along. It's been sort of interesting times leading up to today's event, but we've proceeded. And I just wanted to point out we have hand sanitizer over there. You're welcome to spread out and use the seats to maintain distance between colleagues if you wish to. And yes, we've got more people online, I think, today than we do face-to-face, so welcome to those people who are online watching from afar. I wish to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we gather today, the Turrbal and Yuggera people, and recognise that this has always been a place of teaching and learning. I pay respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue to play within the education and research community. Our next forum, as you can see on the slide there, is on the 7th of May, and it's titled Research in Queensland State Education Sites. It features the Department's research processes and priorities and funding opportunities. The research services team and our colleagues from state schools and from the performance monitoring and reporting area will be presenting the research application and appraisal process for conducting research in schools and other education sites. The Department's refreshed research priorities will also be discussed, current funding opportunities, and how to access departmental data for research projects. So I encourage you to register for this forum once we start advertising it. Turning to today's presentation on early childhood education, innovation, engagement and leadership, we will hear 4 university experts outline their early childhood education projects funded through the Department's Education Horizon grant program. Dr. Marianne Theobald is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Education, School of Early Childhood and Inclusive Education at QUT, and co-leader of the Childhoods in Changing Context research group. Marianne is an interaction analyst whose research focuses on community practices, children's participation in friendships, disputes, peer cultures, and with digital technologies in the home, school and playground, in multilingual and therapy settings. Professor Susan Danby is Professor in the Faculty of Education, School of Early Childhood and Inclusive Education at QUT. She is the Director for the recently funded ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child, located at QUT, and which this department is a partner on as well, which is very exciting. A major focus of her research investigates young children's interactions, including in families and educational contexts, and in medical and health settings. Her recent work involves young children and their use of digital technologies. Dr. Marianne Theobald and Professor Susan Danby will provide a progress update on their Education Horizon project, Empowering Global Learners, a teacher as researcher approach. Professor Amy Cutter-Mackenzie-Knowles is the Dean of the School of Education and Professor of Sustainability, Environment and Education at Southern Cross University. Amy is an experienced early years and primary school teacher. Her research focuses on the conceptualisation and articulation of environmental education, climate change and sustainability in early childhood, schools and teacher education. Amy actively leads and applies child-framed, arts-based research methodologies, giving educators a voice and hand in theory and research. Amy will present a project update on behalf of the project team on mapping scientific concepts through nature play in early childhood education, achieving excellence in STEM through evidence-based pedagogies. Professor Susan Irvine is a Professor in the Faculty of Education at QUT and Head of the School of Early Childhood and Inclusive Education. She is an early childhood professional who has held leadership roles in child and family policy, direct service provision and tertiary education. Susan has led several collaborative multidisciplinary research projects relating to the development of early childhood education and care workforce, with policy and practice implications. This includes 2 connected Education Horizon projects investigating leadership that enables professional practice in centre-based and home-based education and care. Susan will present her project, Professionalism, Paperwork and Pedagogy, identifying leadership strategies that enable professional practice in long day care. As you can see from these projects, the Department's $1 million Education Horizon Research Grant Scheme is funding high-quality local research that aligns with the Government's education priorities. Queensland researchers with a Queensland-based sponsor organisation are eligible to apply. In our previous 3 funding rounds, the Department has funded 46 projects, and we are ramping up to launch the next funding round in about May this year. For more information about the Education Horizon Grant Scheme, please go to our website. As we are web conferencing today, we'll leave most audience questions to the end of the presentation, if that's all right. But please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Marianne and Susan, to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks. We're really happy to be here today to present on our project, to give an update on our Ed Horizon project. And I'd just like to acknowledge our research team, as well as Susan. There's Gillian Bush, Ilana Mushin, and Linda O'Gorman, and Kathy Nilsson, who's here in the second row, and Shelley Radenick, for the research assistants. And I'd like to acknowledge our partner schools, Kelvin Grove State College and Warrigal Road State School, who have contributed time and allowed the teachers to participate and children in this project as well. So the project explores the idea of a global learner and intercultural understanding, and the Department of Education has acknowledged that with the increasing cultural diversity of Australian classrooms, these are key sites where these kinds of capabilities might be enacted and encouraged. But the slogan "Think Global, Act Local" has been adopted by large corporations for marketing and advocacy. And this idea we're trying to think about for the classroom context. So what does this idea mean? And it kind of invokes understandings that to go global, we need to start at a very local level. So that's where our interest is in this project, in how do children's everyday interactions with peers and teachers in culturally diverse classrooms, can they achieve this face-to-face intercultural understandings within very mundane classroom activities, or not so mundane, but very everyday, sorry. So we also draw upon the idea of being a global citizen means having a sense of self, understanding social responsibilities of respect, belonging and collaboration. There's international and national policy that has informed what aspects are important in classrooms and for education. The UNESCO guidelines suggest that learning to know, learning to do, learning to live together and learning to be is a way of focusing on intercultural dialogue and respect. The professional standards for teaching promote supporting student participation, and we have the Early Childhood Australia Code of Ethics, which emphasise valuing diversity and respecting students' backgrounds and with care and compassion. And as well, there's the ACARA intercultural continuum of intercultural understandings, and we're focusing on how does this play out in classrooms.
Okay, so while we see these different policies in practice, sometimes we don't exactly understand what that looks like as we look at the everyday practices of classrooms. So we have policy, we have curriculum guidelines, but sometimes we need to delve into that everyday practice of classroom to understand how they might be implemented within the classrooms, how teachers are understanding them, and how children themselves are understanding these particular policies and practices. So this particular project is located very firmly within that space, bringing together increasing cultural and linguistic diversity understandings, systematic policy imperatives, and also curriculum and pedagogy. And what holds that together, of course, are the interactions that actually happen every day in the classrooms in which we participate. So the theoretical frame that we're using for this today is the ethno-methodological frame. So ethnomethodology, we're looking at a particular aspect of that. It's like ethnography. If you understand about ethnography, ethnomethodology takes up this idea of understanding folk or everyday practices. And we begin with the question, what's happening now? What's happening in this classroom now? And how can we understand that? And there's a particular body of work by Stephen Hester and Dave Francis who talk about culture in action. So very much interested in the everyday cultural practices. Now we've all been exposed to that right here today when we all went to shake hands, right? Or give somebody a hug. And we've had to change our local cultural practices by doing the toe dance or doing namaste and so on. So we're in the process of engaging in a whole range of different local cultural practices. And that's what's happening in these classrooms. We're looking at how are teachers bringing on board these ideas and how are children engaging with them in that local culture in action. It's dynamic. It's not something that's static. It's in action. It's on the move. It's always happening. And that's our focus. So this research project was conceptualized with principals of our 2 partner schools, and it seeks to address these 3 questions. What elements of classroom pedagogy support participation, communication and respect, and the intercultural capabilities of all learners as a global child? What are the young children's perspectives on participating, communicating and belonging in classrooms characterized by cultural and linguistic diversity? And how do teacher researchers investigate and reflect on their own classroom practices in supporting intercultural practices? So this project is designed as a participatory action research. So you've probably all seen that circle of where you start with an issue or an idea. You plan some actions to investigate that further. You collect data about that. You evaluate, you draw some understandings from that. And then you go back into that cyclical approach to really get down into understanding not just what's happening, but some cycles of how we may develop those particular understandings. And this is why we're working so closely with teacher researchers in this, because together we're planning action, together we're looking at the issues, together we're coming up with solutions about how to, or different ways to think about intercultural understandings in classrooms. The settings, as Marianne indicated earlier, are 2 schools in southeast Queensland. Kelvin Grove has a rich diversity, welcoming children from Australia, Brazil, China, Germany, Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, Indonesia, Japan and Italy. And Warragul State School welcomes children from Australia, China, Korea and Indian cultural backgrounds. And these form the majority of the population. So 36% and 71% of these schools have diverse cultures and languages. We're working with 4 prep classrooms, 100 children aged between 5 to 7 years and 4 teachers. There are 4 phases for this particular study. The fieldwork phase has to do with the video ethnography of classrooms. And so we've gone into classrooms and we've used some handheld video cameras, and we've also used, and you can see just in that photo up there to the far left, a pole with an iPad on top. That's an iPad camera on a swivel device. So it follows the action around. It's a bit sort of, it's robotic. It's also a bit weird as you watch it swing towards you. And as Marianne indicated, we're very interested in understanding those interactions around intercultural activities and conversations with the children, among the children, and with the teacher and children.
And then the last phase. So this is just...
Oh yes, here we go, last phase. So here we've got the first phase of the project involved bringing the teachers together in the workshop. The aim was to provide teachers with some skills about being teacher researchers and also to bring them forward into a community of practice to discuss and share their ideas of what it means to be a global learner in a local space. And then the second phase was the going about the everyday activities being video recorded. The third phase is around watching those extracts, the teachers watching those extracts and talking together about what they're seeing and observing, and with the children, where they are shown some of the extracts and they talk about what they're seeing, and then the final one is working back with the teacher researchers in that particular space. Now, as we go forward, what we have here is a whole range, we've selected a few from a whole range of conversations that we've had with the teachers. And this is from our first phase. And we asked them, what is intercultural understanding and what might it look for you in your school? And here are the sorts of things that they said. They just celebrate. By celebrating our diversity at a prep level, the kids will talk amongst themselves, but they won't see it as any kind of difference. That's my friend. Oh, he's from China, and that's why he's speaking that way. But he's my friend. So they don't see it as a cultural thing, I guess. I think that's possibly inherent in just the nature of the age of the children we're working with. And I would also suggest that maybe it's not necessarily age. I think we have probably adults in our world who also think in similar sorts of ways. Children don't think about it think about that in the same way as well. So as we go on, the second quote we have from a teacher is, they like sharing language just in the morning, saying hello, where they say it in all different languages. The kids will say, they'll use someone else's languages as well. Just that sharing, you see. Say for one of my Korean speakers, someone says hello in their language. You'll see their little face light up and somebody else is using the language. And then our third quote, encouraging children to, what's the word? Want to help, have an interest in others. This is not just around themselves. It's finding, feeling like they can love, have a real interest, and really want to find out about others and what they do and how they do things. Now this was at the very first. It's going to be interesting when we go back with the teachers and talk with the teachers about what the children have been saying and how the teachers themselves have been reflecting together as we all reflect together on those ideas.
When just looking at the intercultural understanding learning curriculum from ACARA, we can see that in that episode the children were considering multiple perspectives and empathizing with others, and challenging perhaps ideas as well. So the next phase is where we asked the teachers to act as researchers, and they had some clips. So we asked the teacher to use that clip and ask the children to have a research conversation with her, the children involved in that episode. So in this extract, the ideas are drawn upon from children's rights to have a say, the sociology of childhood, the children's standpoint is of importance, and that this is an interaction in itself, that it's not really about recall, but we're wanting children to unpack their understandings about what's going on. And the next phase we go to is where the teachers are coming back, and we're going to unpack some of those clips with the teachers. They're going to develop more their research toolkit, and by sharing learning some research techniques to unpack and identify some strategies that we'll be using to create some modules for professional learning on being a teacher, researcher, and working in diverse classrooms. So at the local, what we could say now perhaps is that we have this competing kind of structures. We have the policy imperatives, we have curriculum pedagogy, and this increasing diversity in classrooms. And our idea of looking at it from a culture and action perspective asks how this is being practiced on a daily basis, because the children are actually immersed in this very diverse, highly diverse classroom. So it's really about establishing these practices as an every interaction moving forward, rather than pulling out specific times, I suppose, where we might highlight our differences. So that's kind of where we're heading with the project. Thank you.
I acknowledge and pay respects to the ancestors and descendants of the lands upon which we work and meet. I'm mindful that within and without the concrete and steel of this building, the land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So firstly, I'd like to introduce the project team. It's just me here today, but as you all know, with any research project, it's never just one person. So I'm Amy Cutter-Mackenzie-Knowles. Then there's Professor Karen Malone from Swinburne University in Melbourne, Associate Professor Lexi Lazix, also with me at Southern Cross University, and Associate Professor Linda Knight, who's now at RMIT, Dr. Maya Osborne, who is a postdoc at Southern Cross, and Tiffany Cutter, who's a Research Administration Assistant as well. So the research questions, I thought I would start there to give you a bit of context about what they are. So essentially the project is centred on three. So what are early childhood educators' conceptions of nature play and its associated scientific concepts? And then also what are children's conceptions of nature play and its scientific concept? And how nature play pedagogies can best support young children's learning of scientific concepts. So you might ask, well, why scientific concepts in nature play? You know, in a policy and curriculum sense, scientific concepts are understood as knowledge of and respect for natural environments and constructed environments, including relationships with other living and non-living things. And nature play is considered an important pedagogical driver in realising this curriculum imperative. So we know that in terms of the curriculum and policy imperatives. However, what about broadly in terms of more internationally speaking? So in the last 10 years, I'm sure, no doubt you've noticed there's been what some people call a new nature movement. And some of this has been brought about particularly by the forest schools in Scandinavia and then taken up in minority countries like Australia, the UK and so forth. But there's also been books by people like Richard Louv, David Sabel. So have you come across the concept of nature deficit disorder? Yes, no? Some of you yes, some of you no. Now I'm not particularly fond of that concept, but it has gotten real traction though amongst teachers, amongst communities in noticing what they're calling children's lack of experience in nature. And it depends then, well, what do you actually define as nature? Now this research, a problematic with it, is that it's very much from a minority perspective. It doesn't consider majority worlds, which is 80% of the world. But nature deficit disorder, what Louv says it is basically due to a lack of sustained free play in nature, and some of the things he says are diminished use of the senses, attention difficulties and high rates of physical and emotional illnesses. Now, what about nature and nature play itself? Now nature, again, as I was saying, it depends how you look at it. So people like Louv and Sabel define nature as the natural environment or an entity existing outside of the cultural, social world of humans. And this definition strongly advocates and reiterates a nature-human binary, if you like. So where nature is something out there, something very separate to us, that humans are exceptional. So this is one perspective of nature, but there are other perspectives and theories as well, where humans are one of many species, and that represents more of a post-humanist understanding of nature. So people like Ingle, Castry, Taylor are more within that theoretical thinking. But what's really fascinating, in particular in early childhood, is that there's very little contemporary research about how children's conceptions of nature, what do they look like in contemporary Australia, and how might these then inform diverse scientific concepts, you know, particularly in the context of rapid environmental change, which we're seeing at absolute unprecedented times. Now, in terms of research in the Australian context, believe it or not, there's only been one significant study, and that was done by Philip Payne. And his study at that time showed that children tended to externalise, as I was saying, the environment, seeing it as something out there. But, you know, again, that was in 1998, and it's been, what, 20-something years since then. So, in that context, well, what is nature play, and what research has actually been done on nature play? Again, believe it or not, very little on nature play. So there's a lot of anecdotal work about people saying, well, it's just good. And, you know, nature play has its roots in early childhood education, going back to Socrates and Rousseau and Reggio Emilia, you know, as that nature as the third teacher. But what research has actually been done on it? Now, nature play, according to Ernest, is unstructured play in natural settings, involving really very little child-adult interactions. So it's considered in many ways to be free and open-ended play. Now, I'm not saying that that's my conception, that's the conception that this particular researcher puts out there. Now, let's look at this research a bit more in detail before I actually go into our study, because it gives an important context. So there's been one significant study that was done by Vidalia, and she identified two types of nature play. So child nature play and child play in nature. But it was from the perspective of adults. It wasn't from the perspective of children. It was in 2007. But that's actually one of the few studies that's focused on nature play. But what she did find was that, so from the perspective of adults, is that child nature play adults were more likely to be involved in environmental science than those adults who participated predominantly in child-child play. Now, this meant that simply being outdoors was not necessarily enough to foster environmental understandings or scientific concepts. And that's the important thing there. Now let's look at play, because I've looked at nature, now let's look at play. So, what does play research and theory say? Now, there's a lot of, there's a lot of work in this area, as you would all know. And particularly around this notion of, it's not new news that free play doesn't necessarily lead to advanced scientific concepts, if that's the intention. And then there's this, if you like, push for intentional teaching. And in a previous ARC that I did with Susie Edwards, we actually focused on different play types, and that in particular, and what helped conceptual learning. But in this study, and that was fairly conservative, those findings, we came up with 3 different play types, so open-ended, modelled and purposely framed. But in this study, we're aiming to stretch and push this much further through experimentation and creativity. So and the method that we're using is cartography as methodology. Now, this is an educational research methodology, and it's focused on creating visual maps from observations, ideas and pedagogies for nature play. So we draw on Latour's model of cartography, which is focused on the relations between people, places and objects. So that's the essence of this methodology. Now, it's complex in its phases. It has 5 phases altogether, and I'll briefly speak to one, and then I'm just going to give you a bit of a snapshot from each one and some of the things that we've found. Now, the first phase involved the recruitment of teachers, the recruitment of sites. We have 20 sites altogether, 10 sites on the Gold Coast, Brisbane, and 10 sites in central Queensland. and there's a diversity of sites too, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, the first phase also involved those teachers being provided with visual diaries to map common and uncommon sites of nature play, so that we could use that as a baseline. Now, in phase 2, this involved all children across the 20 sites, and 152 children participated. Now, this involved, on a rotational basis, the children using a tablet for over a week period where they conducted their own research. So they were documenting nature play, nature in their everyday lives, and whether that be at kindy, at home, in the community. And then following that, we did a video stimulated interview, so 152 interviews. And now phase 3 was then a professional learning workshop and design of nature play. So we essentially used that workshop as a disruption, as an intervention. So we then reviewed and analysed the data from phase 1 and 2 with the teachers and used that to design nature play experiences that we then that they then implemented. They came up with 3 and they implemented them in their particular settings, and that's the phase we're up to now. So they've all implemented them. We've interviewed the children in focus groups around that, 40 focus groups altogether, and we're about to do teacher interviews and fieldwork researcher observation across several days. And then we'll be doing a meta-cartography. But we're not up to that, so I can't present that at this point. Okay, so it's 38 teachers. Sorry, I had a typo there. But in terms of the diversity of settings, so this is just one setting, so it's 100% outdoor forest kindy that operates out of a black tub. So it has no room, no building, it operates out of a reserve. Now we'll go to another early childhood setting that's located, I think, on the fourth floor of a high-rise building. And this is their setting. And then we've got everything in between as well. So we've got some settings that are more like your Scandinavian type looking kindergarten, to very suburban, to very inner city, to country regional type settings. Now, you remember in phase 1 I said that the teachers we asked them to do visual maps of common and uncommon sites of nature play. So to do that, we gave them visual diaries, and you can see just from this one teacher the sorts of maps they were doing, and I'll flick through them quickly. But through a rhizo analysis, our first cut of the data revealed more about common sites of nature play rather than uncommon sites. But you could assume that given they're not talking about uncommon sites, it's fairly easy to identify what they are. But this is from the perspective of the teacher. And we're also, it's a constant throughout all the project, looking at common, uncommon sites. So here, some teachers talked about so the most common sites were always 100% outdoors. So this notion of nature play is always outdoors, from the perspective of the educator. And some educators, where they were in inner city early childhood centres, tended to indicate that it was around the sand pit or some point of interest like a tree. And then at this time we were really in this particular map, there were quite a lot of maps that depicted fire, and this was at the height of the bushfire crisis in Australia. So that they weren't actually lighting fires, but enacting that process, imagining that process of fire. But also, and you all know, being early childhood teachers, the fantastic work early childhood teachers do in visual diaries and really be able to document and articulate their philosophy. So this particular teacher, and they've all done this beautifully, was articulating her philosophy, which is also an important document in mapping common and uncommon sites of nature play. So here she talks about their philosophy as being first finding place and setting a moral compass, and linking with Val Plumwood, who's a famous environmental philosopher. And then this one is more around the nature play pedagogical drivers, which also speak to the common and uncommon nature play sites. And the children themselves further worked into the visual diaries. So this was around the children's perceptions of the gnome house. And here you can read what the children actually said. That the gnome house is our favourite place. A child-sized, tangled, dark, you have to make yourself small to be there. And the story stones live in there. And again, a bigger picture from one child and a teacher. And then teachers have also been documenting, remember this is at the very start of the project, so very early in, around what they perceived, what sorts of scientific concepts that young people or young children deduced from nature play experiences. And many teachers at that point really focused on things like wind and sun and light and energy and matter. So now let's just jump to phase 2. Now obviously it's far more complex, and I'm just giving you a bit of an update and tour of this data. Now phase 2, you'll remember, involved 152 children all doing their own research. So here I'll share some of the children's data, and we've undertaken a first cut in the analysis with the educators, and I'll share some of those cuts. So this is one child, the child on the fence, and he says, that's me climbing up over the fence to get to the park. Can you get over that fence? Yeah. I just used the stick to help me. Did it work? Yeah. Now, the types of photos we saw, now here's another one of a conversation, is these, I've tried to grab some photos that are representative of the types of things that we saw amongst their photos, and there's naturally thousands of them. So when we were having a discussion with these children, and we said, so while we're talking about nature, can you tell me what is nature? And the child says, nature is plants and animals. And what about the clouds? And the child says, yeah, the sky, the sun, the moon, yeah, that's all nature. And what about the stars? Yeah, that's nature. And what about you? Are you nature? No. What about mummy? Nope, not nature. And then mum says, because we also invited their parents to come to these interviews as a data trustworthy technique, she says, oh, sometimes you find dead moths around the house. What do you do when you find them? And the child says, I pick them up and I keep them. And I use them as a pet. I've still got one. So this speaks to the separation of nature, which is some of what I talked about earlier in the literature as humans as a bit exceptional. But let's go to another perspective. So here we've got another child. And again, you know, this is something we've been deducing in our rhizome analysis. So how do you feel about nature? And the child says, it makes me feel more alive because the leaves give me oxygen. What does nature sound like to you? And the child says, it sounds like kookaburras and snakes and leaves rustling in the wind. Oh, can you tell me some more things you might do when you're in nature? Oh, you mean play with nature? Yeah. What is nature? Well, it's leaves, plants, trees and people. Oh, people. What about other animals? Yeah, other animals too. So their nature? Yeah. What about water? Yeah. What about sky and people? Yeah. So very kind of definite about it. Now another one. Are there play activities you don't like? Sometimes I don't like playing with Lego. I get bored. I get so bored. I just prefer playing with animals. That makes me feel good. Can I ask you a question about nature? Do you know what nature is? Yep. What is nature? About you have to care about bunnies and animals. Oh, that's very kind. When I see flowers, this is the child, I give them to animals. Oh, are flowers nature? Yeah. What about trees? Yep. What about birds? Yep. What about you and me? Yep. What about nature? Do you know why? Why? Oh, I don't know. We just are. So what this says is that there's a real disconnect between what some of the research is saying, as in existing anecdotes that children see themselves as exceptional and separate, Whereas what we found was that perspective is the exception. It's not the common perspective. Children are quite emphatic that they are nature. So then, remember I said then the phase 3, we went on to the professional workshops, which was essentially an intervention, and really staying with the data, with the teachers, in order to design different nature play experiences that we then researched together. And these are some of the visual diary entries of some of their early thinking. And what is captured here is some of the initial reflections of one teacher, and here this teacher speaks to the sensorial experience, focusing on the child's observation encounter versus the adult. This has then led her to design experiences that stayed with such curiosity. So you can't see it very well there, sorry, I thought it was a better quality image. But she really reflects on the children's data itself and that how it's different to her initial impressions in terms of what she thought children's perspectives were. Now in the final phase, phase 4, now this is where we're up to at the moment. So all the teachers have implemented their various nature play experiences. So what this experience was walking the creek. The other experiences that this particular teacher designed was looking deeply at a found dead snake and dissecting. Another experience looking deeply at found objects again, so a sea eagle feather using a digital microscope. And this was all out in the reserve for this particular setting. So as I said before, I can't provide a comprehensive analysis at this point, but what I can discern is that teachers and children's conceptions of nature play and associated scientific concepts are complex and represent quite a different narrative to that of contemporary literature and research. In many respects, the data reveal a coming alive of theory and posthumanism in particular. And so, just to finish up there, with this project, we have a website, and the project is obviously much larger than just the immediate research team and even the participants in the study, and that's helped us to build a childhood nature collective. And if you want to stay connected with the project, you can do so via the website, Facebook or Insta, or email the team. Thanks very much.
It's a collective project that needs all of the best minds and efforts to come to attention. So hopefully today some of the research that we've been doing will provide some thoughts for you to be thinking about as we move into policy and practice solutions. So the work that I'm talking about today, the particular study that I'm talking about today, is actually part of a program of research that's looking at the early childhood education and care workforce. It commenced in 2014 with an ARC-funded linkage project that the department was a partner with. That particular project was led by Professor Karen Thorpe, and it involved a multidisciplinary team of researchers from QUT and from Charles Sturt University, working in partnership with Creche and Kindergarten Association, Good Start Early Learning and the department. Now, that particular study was the very first national study of the early childhood workforce, and it was linked to all of our priorities and our vision in terms of increasing access to higher quality early childhood education and care services prior to school, but recognising that workforce is instrumental to realisation of this vision, and also recognising that we have a problem, we have a number of problems with respect to that. So this particular ARC study was funded to identify factors that were influencing the attraction and retention of qualified educators in centre-based early childhood settings, so kindergarten and long day care services. Now that particular study involved Queensland case studies. We visited 13 early childhood services across Queensland, 3 geographic locations, it was a fairly representative sample of early childhood centres. And during that phase, we also interviewed 98 educators, talking to them about their views and experiences of working in early childhood education and care. The study also involved a national survey which engaged just over 1,200 educators, again seeking their views and experiences of early childhood education and care. Now, the key findings from that particular study really confirmed some things that we knew, but also provided insights into areas that we might want to know more things about. So some key findings from that study included that the majority of the educators that we talked with in that study really recognised, acknowledged the importance of the work that they were doing, and they enjoyed their work with children. However, the study findings also indicated that pay, conditions and professional recognition were still major challenges in terms of attraction and retention. The study findings also indicated that up to 1 in 5 educators were actually planning to leave their work in the next 12 months, so high attrition rates. And when we went back to the Queensland case studies and actually saw real-time skill loss, it was actually much higher than that. So across the 3 geographic locations and the 13 early childhood services in Queensland, we ended up with an attrition rate of 37%. And it was actually 45% in the remote location. So the area that we visited in the Queensland study had almost a half skill loss in terms of educators. Now, while we were out visiting these particular centres, something about some of the centres that we visited really intrigued us. So while we were seeing these particular findings, when we were actually in centres, we had this sense that some centres were doing better in terms of creating a positive and supportive workplace. And not surprisingly, when we brought that information back and looked at the data, there were positive results in terms of educators' morale, engagement and retention. So we really thought that that was something that we wanted to know more about, and that's where this second study came in. We were wanting to go back to those particular centres to find out what was it that was happening in these centres that was creating an environment that seemed to be working to retain staff. So here is the program of research. I just talked with you a little bit about the National Early Childhood Education and Care Workforce Study, and the study that I'm going to be talking with you about today is situated in long day care. We chose that site because that's one of the most challenging sites in terms of attracting and retaining qualified educators. And we're looking at what leadership is enabling professional practice and supporting retention of staff in these centres. So the aim of this particular study was focusing on the role of the centre director as service leader and manager. What were these centre directors doing? What strategies were they using to enable professional practice and to enable educators to engage and enjoy their work within their centres? Now, we acknowledge that leadership isn't just about positional leadership, and that lots of other factors come into play in terms of leadership, but we really felt that the centre director was playing a very significant role in these particular centres, and so it was true. Following the design of the original National Early Childhood Workforce Study, we wanted to go back to the 3 geographic regions that we had covered in the Queensland case studies, and we used a range of positive workplace indicators, including retention, to identify the top performing long day care centre in each of these regions. So we ended up with 1 centre in each of these particular regions. In terms of the spread, all of these were long day care centres, as I said. 2 were standalone centres and 1 was operated by a large early childhood education and care organisation. The profile of educators was fairly typical and was reflective of the most recent National Early Childhood Education and Care Workforce Census. what we wanted to do in terms of visiting these particular services was to build a 360-degree view of leadership from the perspective of the leaders and also from the educators working in those particular centres. So we engaged the participants in in-depth interviews with the centre directors, and we undertook a facilitated questionnaire with all of the educators, and we had a 90% participation rate in all of these centres, which was important in terms of getting that 360-degree view of leadership and what was happening in these particular centres. Now, as I said, this is all about the centre directors. They were our particular focus. So who were these centre directors? I'm sure you won't be just surprised to know that they were all women. They were mature women, and they had all been working in early childhood education and care for some time. 2 had more than 10 years experience and 1 had more than 15 years experience. 2 had been in their centres for over 10 years. 2 had, advanced diploma qualifications, and 1 was an early childhood teacher. But the thing that stood out for us was that all of these directors talked about the fact that they had travelled the ranks in early childhood education and care. Do you know what that means? Yeah, it means that they actually started as assistants and they worked their way through qualification pathways and career pathways to reach the position of centre director. And interestingly, that actually gave them a lot of respect within the centre. All of their staff really felt that they understood what was happening on a daily basis, and that comes up quite a lot in our findings. So I'm going to give you just some headlines in terms of this particular study and some of the things that we were looking at. Really looking at these particular questions. The study was about professional practice, so we wanted to know how did educators and leaders in these services see professional practice. We wanted to know what the centres were actually doing to enable professional practice. We wanted to know what difference that was making in terms of educator morale, engagement and retention. And then we really wanted to drill down to find out what was working in these centres and what were these directors doing. So a quick tour of some of the key findings. Our first question was, thinking about long day care, what does the term professional practice mean to you? We had in our minds the definition of professional practice as presented in the National Quality Framework, but clearly it's important to see how that's playing out on the floor. We looked at educators' responses, and in terms of priority, these were the things that stood out for the participants in this study. Now, it's interesting when you think about this in terms of current policy perspectives. Perhaps not surprising that curriculum and teaching educational context is top of the list, because that's certainly what we're promoting in our current policy platform. Of interest and pleasure to us is that caring for children is also in this list. That's not something that we often see highlighted in policy contexts at the moment, and we're also finding that when educators are talking about professional practice, they tend to defer to the educational context and leave out the caring side of things, because that's not always recognised broadly as being professional and deserving of professional status. You can see here that there's an emphasis on collegiality and teamwork, working with colleagues and working in partnership with families, so the relational side of the work. And we thought that the other thing that was interesting here was this notion of meeting requirements. I need to clarify that for you. That's not just about meeting regulations or meeting the National Quality Framework. These services were establishing their own shared expectations and requirements in terms of professional practice. So they were meeting their requirements, which helped them to meet the National Quality Framework expectations. So they were owning these requirements. It wasn't about doing the regulations. So we were keen to know, what were these services doing? How were the centre directors enabling professional practice? Now, they were using a range of different strategies, but what we wanted to know was, what did the educators value the most? Perhaps you won't be surprised. Top of the list, the 2 top of the list things were spending time reflecting, collaborating, discussing practice with colleagues, and also the availability and the accessibility of the centre director as a leader who was able to come out and be with the educators and support them in their learning and support them in their practice. You can see emotional and physical support were also identified. This is about effective teams working together and supporting each other and providing the support that they needed to function well. It's interesting too that there was a focus here on learning together. A couple of these centres actually had dedicated study mentor positions in addition to the position of educational leader. So they were really looking at a distributed model and trying to leverage the wisdom within the area. We were surprised about this. We really thought that non-contact time would be top of the list. But when we looked at this, we've decided that these centre directors seem to be finding time and making time during the workday and around hours for the educators to come together at various times and in various ways. Now, none of these services had lots and lots of spare money. They were all operating on budgets, but the directors were very, very strategic about how they used any available resources, including spare time. So what difference were these leaders actually making and the creation of a positive and supportive workplace? We used a number of measures in this study that corresponded to the national study that we had undertaken so that we could compare and see how these centres were doing. And not surprisingly, they were doing a lot better than the average in terms of the National Early Childhood Education and Care Workforce Study. So in these centres, more than half of the educators were actually engaged in further study. The majority of them were studying to upgrade to a diploma, but there was a higher proportion of early childhood teachers training as well. In terms of centre morale, this was a question we asked on a Likert scale. The study is the dark blue and the national study is the light blue, and you can see that these educators appear to be much more satisfied with their work. Centre morale is higher. And we also talk with them about their retention intention over the next 12 months. And again, you can see that the educators in this particular study are indicating that they expect to be there in 12 months more so. We didn't ask about long-term retention in the national study, but in this particular one we did, and this information is really interesting as well. Our findings show that a large number of the educators were happy in their centre and wanted to be there for a period of time. We had a number of people who were aspiring to leadership roles, some of them within the same centre. A few who were looking at owning their own centres and wanted to take what they had learnt from their centre to put it to work in their own centre. You can see here that we've got some movement between early childhood long day care services, kindergartens and schools, but it's actually less than what we had expected. And one of the interesting things here, which I think we're all aware of, is the number of a percentage of people who will be retiring in the next 5 years. So, what were these leaders doing? What was it that we actually found that stood out for us in terms of these leaders and how they were enabling professional practice and supporting a positive environment that was retaining their staff? One of the first things that really stood out to us was that these centre directors articulated very clear expectations of the team. Now these came from the centre director themselves in terms of their personal perspectives on professional practice, but they were negotiated and developed with the actual team. And these transcended philosophy into detailed ideas about how practices would be undertaken, and also just little tasks in terms of day-to-day operation, how they would be shared, and people would work together to make sure that some staff weren't overburdened by certain aspects of the day. And the idea that you needed to meet team expectations so that everyone could do their job well. So there was this sense of shared ownership. And you can see the expectations of the directors reflected in some of the educators' responses to these questions as well. So a really strong focus on doing your job well. These educators, these directors, none of them were non-contact directors. none of them were contact directors, they were all non-contact directors, but they were very, very present and available to staff. They weren't sitting in their offices. 2 of them spent an inordinate amount of time on the floor, which is another issue for us to think about just in terms of their health and well-being. But they prioritised the work that educators were doing, and they were there and visible and available for them, supporting them in that particular work, because that was the bread and butter of the service. And again, you can see the respect that comes with that, the sense that educators felt that their centre director understood the nature of the work and that she was available to support them. The directors were very proactive in managing workload as well. So they understood the complexity and the busyness of the day from their own experience and from their wisdom, and they were looking at ways of helping their educators to manage that workload. And that was very, very visible in terms of documentation, in particular curriculum documentation. All of these centres had moved away from targets. The centre directors had all established the fact that targets for certain amounts of documentation was just resulting in a mass of unproductive paperwork, basically. And so they had reorganised to focus on quality, not quantity, and they had given permission for educators to really think about how that was going to work for them. And you can see the relief and the sense of support that came with that for educators working in those services. The centre directors really reported that they were seeing much better results in terms of that, and seeing better learning and shared learning through that process as well. Now, they all talked about the importance of ongoing professional learning and the need to continue to support personal and professional growth. Interestingly, it was a different context in these services. Because they didn't have the movement, all of these services said that they had to think of different ways to be able to provide new learning and new challenges to keep current staff engaged. Otherwise, they knew that they would leave. And so they were always busy thinking about opportunities for the team to learn, and also distributed leadership opportunities that tended to move and shift so that other educators would have an opportunity to be challenged and to engage in leadership. And again, you can see the culture flowing through to educators working with these particular directors. And basically, these educators just exuded respect and admiration, both for the work. They talked about the work in a really positive way. We could see that when they were talking with families as well. So there was a really positive presentation or representation of the professional work that educators were doing. And they certainly had respect for the people that they were working with, and saw their main job as supporting the professional practice of educators, that was the essence of providing high quality early childhood education and care. So to conclude, we asked all of the people involved in the study, the centre directors and the educators, what does a successful director look like? There was a large number of responses that was like the one we've got. So there was clearly some sense of support for the directors that were in these particular areas. But you can see there just some of the key concepts that come through, and that notion of being a tangible support and being available to educators, being approachable, accessible and visible were key things. We've actually put together some summaries in very plain English for everybody to access openly for both of these studies. The first one there on the right is the findings from the National Early Years Workforce Study, and the second one there is from the study that I've just talked about, Professionalism, Paperwork and Pedagogy, Enabling Professional Practice in Long Day Care Services. And we're currently now extending our focus with another Education Horizon grant to have a look at effective leadership in family daycare, acknowledging that family daycare is a completely different context, and a context where distributed leadership is absolutely essential. So fact in family daycare we can have distributed leadership and it can be done well or it can be done not well, but it is a requirement when you have a workforce that is actually distributed in a number of different areas, including geographic locations. So currently working on that one, and I'd be delighted to report on that at some point in the future. Thank you. I should acknowledge our team as well. There's the team for the current study.
We have some questions from the floor.
Hi, with the Nature Play project, I was just wondering if you included any school distance education. You said you had Central Queensland. Did you have any distance education in there at all, or was there any difference in the perception of Nature Play with distance education?
So yes, we did. We actually had a site up in Weipa, or we do, I should say. So we've been managing that data collection entirely online and via Zoom, but we are going to make one, we can only afford one trip up there because it costs quite a bit of money. And in that particular centre, there's also a high number of Indigenous children as well. And so we're only just grappling with that actually, with some different themes that are coming through and strong connections with country in particular. So yeah, so sorry I can't be more comprehensive on that, but we haven't done our actual, if you like, our significant field work there.
It's great that they're included.
Yeah, yeah. So it was quite a push to, because they were desperate to be included, and we thought, oh, this is complicated, but then we thought, well, we'll make it work because, and they said, it fitted with what they want to do, but also more so what they want to understand because they're grappling with this nature play pedagogies day in, day out.
I've got one for you, Susan. Something that you touched on was working your way through the ranks for people who come in as directors. Because one thing we've noticed from an industry perspective that it's particularly difficult for primary teachers who come in as an ECT or as a director, and often there becomes a bit of a yin and a yang, and how we cross that void that we're all working together. So there is that perception in the industry as well, if you come from another sector, seeing that as an outsider, or there's that otherness that exists. And the challenge with that is getting the culture where we actually value the diversity that we all bring.
Yeah.
So, you know, if we've had people come in from nursing sectors that bring a whole different lens that is of value as well. But it seems like there's that constant tension that you're not one of us, and breaking that void where us is part of the many, and almost going back to intercultural understanding and intercultural perspective of our different lenses as well. So we shouldn't have to shift our professional pedagogy in place of someone else's, but perhaps we find how we can have that cross-pollination and bring it to a different level. But I find that that's a barrier in the industry we're constantly pushing back on, because we're perceived as, you know, if you've been from primary, oh, well, you don't really know about care, you know. So there's a double-edged sword going on that we need to identify exists. Or is there? But we've had that experience.
Yeah, no, I think that you're right, and I think that that's an essence of feeling that has been shared previously as well. I think it's that with leadership though. I think, you know, one of the things that we really learned from the leaders in this particular study, and we know through the literature in educational context, is the benefits of democratic and collaborative leadership. It actually, you know, embraces different views and perspectives. We emphasise, you know, critical reflection, and we emphasise working together as a team. So I think that it's really looking at what everyone contributes and valuing all of those things. So I think to help us to move beyond that reality at the moment, we need really effective leadership. And that needs to start in our pre-service education and training context. It certainly needs to happen within services, and it needs to happen in the broader policy and practice environment where we're valuing different perspectives equally.
And I think getting places to work, like you said, culturally towards shared understandings.
Yes.
That's really the key to everyone, you know, having that sense of alignment.
Yes, and I guess it's about guarding against that notion that we know what we're doing and this is the only way to do it, because the new person coming in might have some really good ideas to be able to contribute to the team, but it's starting from valuing what is and thinking about what might be as a shared entity.
I think the move in status will make a difference there too. I think as early childhood teachers are seen more as professionals and valued more for their contribution to education, I think that will make a big difference in that perspective. We hope to see that.
And early childhood teacher registration will be an important part of that from a policy perspective.
What struck me when you went through was from your experiential sort of basis, the answers to good leadership could have come out of the leadership literature,
Yes.
Hollis Bolus, right?
Yes.
So is it that people have to learn it themselves rather than them kind of through the education pathway, being exposed to leadership in practice being an important discipline to get across? Is that sort of...
I'm not sure of the question either.
Obviously, sort of those centre directors that you've interviewed and the staff you've interviewed have come to that conclusion themselves, and yet the national study kind of shows that that is not necessarily a shared understanding. So is part of the answer maybe more investment in understanding leadership capability and growing that in the service sector?
Yeah. I'll just start with your first perspective. I'm not sure until we represented these findings to everybody that everyone understood what they were doing and the essence of that being very effective leadership. You know, these women were particularly modest and, as we often find in educational contexts, really weren't seeing what they were doing as anything particularly special. And it was only when we really were able to sit down with them and say, this is what we're seeing. And of course it does line up with a lot of the literature, but it's contextualised within their particular settings. We're also very keen to say that this isn't a recipe. We've said in all of our work that these are things for centres and for leaders and for educators to reflect on and think about, you know, what they're doing in terms of enabling professional practice. But yes, ultimately it's about providing opportunity to build leadership capacity, and that seems to be a good investment because it's making a significant difference in context. So you know, it's a way of implementing policy to actually develop leaders who are able to take that policy to the next level.
I think it was interesting that educators saw that the director, who was on the floor a lot and doing practical things, seemed to have value. So it's around the value that educators are putting on what they think is important as leadership capacity. And sometimes they don't know what they don't know. So for myself, coming from a primary background, a lot of that was very scary to begin with, because it was like the crab bucket. They wanted to sort of keep you down in that sameness, and but really when they became open to new ideas and ways of working, it increased that understanding for everyone. So I think there's some work to be done in that area.
And collaboration is the key, as you just said.
I've got a question for everybody. I just noticed across the three projects that each of them is very participatory, each of them is working very collaboratively with schools, and there is a lot of effort being shown too. I loved the pieces of work that you were showing, Amy, these diaries, and yet, you know, paperwork is something that we know from Sue's study is something that is sometimes resisted. So I'm interested in that observation. What was it that you were doing with working with those early childhood settings and schools as well that made people so invested in your research?
I can have a go. I think for our project, the teachers were seeing it as a learning experience and for professional learning. So we offered them the first workshop where we talked through what it might mean to be a practitioner researcher. We went through some research tools and exposed them to some ideas, perhaps from children's rights perspectives and children's standpoint, that underpinned our study, and some of them hadn't really engaged a lot with those kinds of ideas, in a research frame. So they're really excited to kind of learn from that perspective.
I also think they really love the idea of networking, coming together, being part, sharing their stories, sharing their questions, and then collaboratively working towards some outcome.
I think we all like to talk about our work, and educators really like to talk about what they're doing and the importance of what they're doing. The other thing I would point out from our study is that it built on a previous study. So we had a relationship with these services, and they were so welcoming of us coming back and finding out more. So I think that the opportunity to have a little bit of time and to build a trusting relationship so that everyone can feel secure and able to share is instrumental to that.
And I guess what I can say is that from the perspective of our study, it was very much with teachers and with children, where they're philosophers and researchers. And in terms of like the visual diary, for instance, I think it's about the medium. So and that seemed to suit these particular group of people, but across a lot of different studies I've found through arts-based methods in particular, and through creativity and experimentation, it seems to work with teachers, whether early childhood or primary or secondary. If I was to do it in quite a stagnant way, it doesn't necessarily work, but I think it's also about variety and giving them options too. So some of them actually did want to do more of a digital type diary, whereas others were doing video diaries and the like. But a lot did go for that immersive experience of, pastels and paper, and because they can do it with the children, which was something that's really come across, is the teachers they don't do it, take it home and do it in their own time. They're doing it as a collaboration, so there's a kind of double folding of collaboration, which has been really lovely to see in our project.
Amy, I would have been particularly interested, given the work in the kindergarten space within state system, the possibilities around understanding place in nature and space and country for our regional and remote kindies, where I suspect the children might have some really unique perspectives of what country means when you're on very vast lands.
And we can, though you're absolutely right, and in this particular study we've gone out as far as Emerald, which was actually near a little town that I grew up in called Thierry. So I kind of know what that experience is like, which helped actually, because straight away they were like, "Oh, you're the Cutters, we know you." And I was like, "I haven't been there for 30 years, but instantly then you're part of the group, and that actually makes a difference in rural and regional areas, at least in my experience. And what we found, for instance, in one preschool I was there for the day, and they had all these planned activities. Then all of a sudden a parent showed up with a baby calf, and he said he thought he'd just dropped by, had it in the back seat. And again it was this kind of, I guess, this spontaneity that is far more prevalent, well, at least what we've found within these regional and remotes, and I guess more of a connection between families and the centres and themselves, and the families being involved, like coming with your cow to the site, which then opened up a whole lot of wonderful conversations around, where's mum? And the mum had passed away due to the drought, and they were hand feeding, and they thought all the kids would like to see her, and around animals themselves, and then they got into ethics and all sorts of things. So,
One final question. I was just wondering if, what's been the result of some of this work as far as have professional networks formed? Like, do these teachers still keep in contact, these directors and teachers and educators still keep in contact with each other?
In all of the studies?
Yeah.
Well, we started a Childhood Nature Collective, and we did that right at the beginning. So they're all in it already, and all their friends have joined and families as well. But it's opened up these beautiful conversations because it's something we wanted to keep sustained. So any of you can join too. So there's Facebook, Instagram. I'm not a big Insta fan. Well, I'm getting used to it. And our website too, and blog.
Unfortunately, my answer is no, because all of the services that we've engaged with, we've protected their identity. So those particular services, a number of the leaders have seen the strength in collaboration and are working in their own local networks. Some were already, some were strengthening that, but no, not my own linkage because of the desire to protect confidentiality and anonymity.
So the project's still ongoing, and we plan to, we have another workshop for the teachers where we'll be looking at the videos and photos, and hopefully we are going to be planning some learning modules with them, and also down the track we hope to be doing shared publications, and also, do you want to add that a bit?
We just gave you a snapshot of one of the parts of the study today. We couldn't do it all in 20 minutes, but we do also really want to come back and explore much more around diversity of language in classroom, because I think that's where there's lots of questions that people have. How do you get beyond a tourist approach to diversity of language? And so that's part of the forthcoming work around that.
Thank you to our 4 excellent presenters. It's been really exciting to hear the results of Education Horizon projects that have been funded by the department, and to dabble in that early childhood space too, which is an area of particular interest of my own. So if we could all thank our presenters, and there is